Welcome everybody. It's time for the last formal part of our agenda for the day, the keynote presentation. I think the most important part, the most enjoyable part, although it's going to be hard to beat the session we just had. And also all the wonderful posters that are out there that I hope you've all had a chance to see and vote for your favourites. The most popular posters are going to be given an award. It's been a full afternoon, and I was just reflecting with some colleagues who have been at past Bracewater Days in different formats. I think back then more on the McDonald campus. But it's so great to be together, and so great to see our colleagues that we might not have seen for a while, to see all the graduate students working on so many different important issues around water, and also some partners and external members of the community to McGill who are also interested and keen to be part of the conversation. I'm Gordon Hickey. I'm the director of the Bracewater Centre, and I'm up here representing a small but I think effective group of Brace team members. We have Professor Jan Adamowski, who's one of our associate directors, Professor Stephanie Loeb, who's here as well, over here, who's an associate director, so we guide the academic mission. And then we have a really amazing team of management team, Monica, who you've met, Irene, who's at the back, and Parisa, who's running around keeping us all on track. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We recognise and thank Indigenous peoples for their stewardship of the lands and waters that continue to sustain us today. And as we come together for Bracewater Day, we are reminded that our conversations about water must also reflect the values of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility that are central to truth and reconciliation. The Brace Centre has been around for quite a long time. For some of you, it's the first time you've interacted with it. It might be the first time you've heard of it. It was established in 1959, so for others, it's been here as long as it's been at McGill and an institution of McGill as long as they can remember working at McGill. It has a long tradition of applied water, land, food and energy-related research, training and capacity building internationally. And so it's quite plausible that you could travel quite far and wide and bump into someone who has heard of the Brace Centre. It's jointly based in the Faculty of Engineering and the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, but our vision is broader, and we welcome members from all across the university who work on water issues, irrespective of faculty. Over the past year, we've been focused on revitalising the centre, and we've been basically working towards this moment where we come together and reflect and celebrate. We've supported new collaboration within McGill, new partnerships, cross-faculty partnerships through seed grants. We've worked to leverage funding from provincial and Canadian institutions such as Centro. We've also been working in partnership with other initiatives within McGill, such as the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative. We want to stimulate cross-faculty work on water issues, and we also want to stimulate cross-university work as we look forward. We've expanded opportunities for students and trainees, including top-up awards. Many, hopefully all of them are here. And we're trying to sort of enhance their ability to make high-impact research on water issues. We've established a Canada-US Fulbright Research Chair in Water for a prominent US scholar who studies water issues to spend a semester at McGill to get to understand and participate in McGill life, to contribute to Canada-US understandings, and to develop new collaborations, I guess, ultimately in the project of peace. We've also just, the last 2 days, I think we've launched a Brace Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Water Award, and that's designed to host a Canadian equivalent, senior Canadian scholar who works on water issues for a semester at McGill, and we encourage all of you to nominate people and distribute that opportunity to through your networks. So you're not really here to hear from me. So the Bracewater Day in a nutshell, is a celebration, a moment to connect, and a moment to reflect on the many dimensions to achieving sustainable water futures that are also just. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Vivian Yargo, the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering, and conveniently for me, a water scholar, which makes my life easier, to say a few words of welcome. Vivian.
Thank you, Gordon. It is so inspiring as a researcher who for more than 2 decades dedicated my research to the protection of water resources to see so many researchers, students, and partners gathered here today to celebrate and to advance research on one of the most essential resources, water. The Brace Water Day, so the event today, is about connection, about linking people, linking communities, and linking ideas. And it seems like the previous session did that very efficiently based on what I heard. Unfortunately, I missed it. And today, as Gordon mentioned, marks a new chapter for Brace, with the objective of positioning Brace to really lead and to be the gateway for water research at McGill. And the team, so Living Water, Our Shared Responsibility for Canada's Water, reminds us that water is shared, that it's a value that we shared across communities and knowledge systems as well. So water cannot be managed, cannot be studied in silos, because it's shared. And it's not shared just among researchers, but it's shared globally for everyone on the planet. So the theme is also a call for us to work together for resilience in a changing world. So it's a very timely symposium and a very well-chosen theme for the first Water Day under the new leadership of Brace. And globally, water security faces growing challenges, I'm sure you know. Climate change is reshaping river basin, it's reshaping ecosystem and even economies in several places in the world. Here in Montreal, if I use just one example, this past summer, record low level of the St. Lawrence really strained municipal systems, led to advisories, something that we were not used to in Quebec or used to even in Canada. And it's a clear reminder that resilience is lived daily. So we're not addressing a future problem, we're addressing current challenges. And in Canada, often we feel that because water is so abundant that it's not really an issue, but it really masks vulnerabilities that we have with water in Canada as well. But luckily, they're promising emerging, oops, sorry, I touched the screen. Yep. There's promising pathways that are emerging, and there are community-led responses to address those issues, including indigenous leadership and knowledge that we have to take into account as we develop solutions. And at McGill, we have the responsibility to support those initiatives, and we have to mobilize our most important asset, our students. So I'm pleased to see so many of you here today. So today, let's learn, collaborate, but also reaffirm our commitment to Canada's waters. I think that's a very important step as we try to work together. So I thank you for being here. I thank the team of Brace for organizing the event. I thank our guest speaker for joining us and starting a discussion on how to approach water management, water research more globally in Canada. That's definitely needed and very exciting that we're moving in that direction. So thank you.
Okay, I may have left my notes there. 1 second, I just want to make sure I've got my notes for introducing. Must have done something strange with them. Huh. Is it on the floor? Oh, yes, thank you. Nothing was destined to go perfectly, you know that. Okay, thank you, Dean Yago. We're on the same page, and our guest speaker is here to further explain, I think, what's on that page. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Zafar Adeel. Professor Adeel is the Executive Director of the Pacific Water Research Centre at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. He has over 30 years of experience in a broad range of environmental science and policy issues and engineering, which includes 18 years of work as a United Nations official working on international development and research, most notably, I guess, serving as the director of the United Nations University Institute for Water for 10 years. His research focuses on the intersection of water security, technological innovation, community engagement, and policy. And today he's going to share with us his experiences and his perspective on Canada's role in addressing global water challenges. And there'll be time after the presentation for discussion. And so please reflect while you're listening, and don't be shy to engage us in some conversation. So the floor is yours, Professor Adeel. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Vivian, for your kind words. It's, I think, a good opportunity, and Brace Water Centre has provided this opportunity to engage in a conversation about where Canada is and where we would go in future. So I would like to be provocative, I guess, as I go through my comments. And these are meant to provoke a conversation and how we might collaborate. So before I continue, I would like to also acknowledge that we are on territory which has been used by Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people historically, and this has been a space and place for meeting and exchange of ideas over historical times. And this is precisely what we are intending to do here, so I think it's quite appropriate. And I would like to add a footnote that we at the School of Sustainable Energy Engineering, which is kind of my other hat, we take the Indigenous engagement quite seriously. And over the last 3 years, we've run through a dialogue on incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into engineering curriculum and practice. So it sounds fancy, but it's actually fairly complicated. It has some challenges. We just had one part of that dialogue last week as to align with the Truth and Reconciliation Day. So it's something, this acknowledgement, land acknowledgement, is not pro forma. It's something that we take very seriously. And I hope that our partners at McGill University do the same. So I'll walk through this idea of where we are, and I'll use the global and geostrategic challenges as a way of providing context of where we are and where we need to go. And I'll zoom in a little bit more and talk about what the perceptions of water are in Canada and what the reality is and how those two mesh in or perhaps not. And in the third part, I'll leave you some more thought-provoking ideas on where some of our knowledge gaps are and where we need to fill in those gaps and what some of those mechanisms might be. And again, before I get to the substance of what I'm to present, I was also asked to give a short 2-minute commercial for my center, so I'll do that in just 2 slides. So the Pacific Water Research Center has been around for about 10 years now, and it's been the genesis of it was to essentially ensure that there is collaboration amongst researchers, initially within SFU and then more broadly, to create these coalitions of people who normally would not work with with each other to mobilize resources so that those actions can move forward, and also importantly serve as a bridge between scientific knowledge and policy audiences. And it's a bridge that goes both ways. Our strategic priorities are to engage with communities, to look at how climate change adaptation and resilience building can plug in with those communities, and also to achieve water security. And again, we come at it both from the policy side and technology side. So here's just some quick examples to give you an idea of the kind of things we're doing. We're partnering with the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, or APRU. And within that, we collaborated on a Sustainable Cities and Landscapes conference earlier this year in Vancouver. And we're also a part of the Asia Pacific Mayors Academy, where we are working with mayors from pretty much all developing countries in helping them create ideas for sustainability and resilience building in their own neck of the woods. We have a long-standing project looking at nutrition through engagement and agricultural technologies, or NEAT as we say it, and this works directly with First Nations communities in BC, and we are looking at supporting and promoting use of greenhouse for food production and food sovereignty, and we engage quite proactively with youth and school children in those communities to make sure that the STEM component of those learnings are trickling through. This year we've started a project with an organization called Metro Vancouver that serves all the, I think 18 or 19 municipalities in the Metro Vancouver area with water. So we're looking at using machine learning tools to identify where the water losses are taking place in the distribution system. So this is where the technology part is coming in. And we have also significant activities on public outreach. One that I would like to mention is that we had a public dialogue with Science World in Vancouver. This was a public-facing dialogue. We called it To Catch a Falling Sky, and this was in response to the media coverage of climate change that says, oh, the sky is falling. And so we're saying, no, there's solutions and there's technologies and there's approaches that have worked in the past that are being developed, and so that's kind of what we wanted to promote. And we have the virtual seminar series as well. So I'd invite you to look more at the PWRC website. I don't want to take too much time here. So let's talk about the context of where we are. And I'm going to be using Slido, so if you want to scan the QR code, you can do that here. If you have Slido installed on your smartphone, that would be great. So in one word, 20 characters or less, if you can identify what do you think is the greatest global challenge today? And it's an open question. Anything you would like to say. Thank you. You guys are a really proactive bunch. Thanks for engaging. So I think, not surprising, given the audience, I think water access, water, climate change are important issues. War certainly is on many people's mind, or I would say the flip of it, peace is on very many people's minds. One thing that I didn't expect is misinformation, which I think is also interesting, and I think there's ways, at least in our context, to see how that can be addressed. So thank you very much for participating, and I think in the interest of time, I'll move forward. I think we have a general picture of the word cloud, which is getting richer, but not changing much. So I'll actually start where the middle of this slide is. I don't know if this is a coincidence, but I want to talk about climate change and water security. So this is a forecast and an analysis done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its 6th and latest assessment. And it basically shows the state of global water security. And just to describe, on the right-hand side at the bottom, you see a list of the 4 elements that are creating this composite aggregated global water security index. So water management, water quality and safety, whether water services are accessible for everyone, and whether water is available for doing whatever you need to do or use that water for. So yellows, beige, and brown are colors that indicate that the populations living in those areas are very insecure. And again, as you would expect, most of northern and sub-Saharan Africa is shaded in that color. Similarly, you look at Central Asia, parts of Middle East, even parts of East Asia, the level of water insecurity, if I can put it like this, is quite high. And what you would probably not find or not expect to see so much is those dots in the Midwest in the U.S. and in the Prairie region in Canada. So we are, in a position where water security is a challenge in parts of Canada, whether we recognize that or not. Another way to look at it is to look at the climate change impacts on river discharges. So the World Meteorological Organization a couple of years ago did a study, and they looked at the average annual river flow and compared it with the historical average. And they wanted to look at where the water flow was less than what the average is. And oranges and dark oranges are areas where water is either below the average or much below the average. And again, the areas I was pointing out earlier, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, you would expect those to be the areas. But again, it's a bit of a surprise, or maybe not for some of us, that North America also has significant areas where the river discharges are below their historical averages. And that gets a little bit worse in the western half of Canada. So let's zoom in and talk a bit about what the climate change forecasts are for Canada. And I'm sure to many of you, these would be very familiar aspects. So when we look at temperature, the rate at which Canada is warming is about twice the global average. And if you go to the north, the Arctic part of Canada, the warming is about triple the global average. So we're going a little bit faster in that direction. And it also means that there is an increase in average temperatures across the country. And a consequence of that is that the subarctic snowpack and the glacial mass is also undergoing reduction. And that will have significant long-term consequences for water availability in Canada. The other interesting bit is that the precipitation patterns are shifting. So we're going from we're moving more towards precipitation in the winter season. We're also having that switch from snow to rain. So that's part of the global warming effect that we see. And of course, as I was saying previously with temperature, the precipitation changes are also greater in the north. We think that southern Canada, and this is where majority of the Canadian population lives, will have decreased summer participation certainly towards the end of the century. But I can tell you from British Columbia's experience, and I've been there for 9 years now, the precipitation levels have been going drastically lower in summer months. And we've had restrictions on water usage, sometimes at the drought footing, depending on which year you talk about. And we've also had an extreme heat dome a few years ago where the temperatures hit upwards of 45 degrees Celsius for a number of days. So, and that's kind of a segue into the extreme events. So heat waves are expected to intensify and continue. Extreme precipitation events, and I'll give you an example in a second of atmospheric rivers. Those are also projected to intensify. Wildfire activity is projected to intensify across all of North America. And again, when I first moved to British Columbia, I thought this was a Western Canada thing, that you had uncontrolled wildfires every summer, and you were sort of doing a count of how many wildfires were controlled and how were under control, et cetera. But this has spread across, and we've seen this in the past couple of years in Ontario, here in Quebec, and we've seen the air pollution impacting other parts of the eastern seaboard, so to speak. And the sea level rise will also continue, and of course the rates will be different across the country from coast to coast to coast. Now, here's an example of the atmospheric flooding event that we had in November 2021. And this was quite catastrophic, where the British Columbian province was cut off from rest of Canada for several weeks. That means the land connection was washed out, the highways were gone, bridges were gone, the railroad connection was gone, and so the government had to jump in on emergency basis and try to fix that. And as an interesting footnote, initially they said the estimate for repair for this one single event was going to be of the order of $750 million. Within a few weeks, we could tell that the damage and the repair was going to cost actually much larger. So that $750 million were the insured losses, and the Insurance Bureau of Canada could put those out right away. The conservative estimate was between $10 and $15 billion. And if you ask me, and my center ran a study on economics of flood impacts, even those are underestimates. So the actual damage and loss to the economy was much larger. And some of those damages were not restricted to British Columbia, but because goods are shipped from Vancouver Port inland, so those continued. Last year, almost about a year ago, we didn't quite have a repeat, but we had flooding in Metro Vancouver area, which is not very common. So again, an event where streets turned into gushing streams. Again, quite unusual. And the point I'm trying to get across is that these unusual events are occurring with more frequency. What are we doing on the global scale to address those? So back in 2015, for those of you who remember, there was a big climate summit in Paris. In December, we had one of the largest delegations was from Canada, led by our then Prime Minister Trudeau, who had just come into the office. And everyone was very excited because Paris was going to turn the ship around. And the key idea was to limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, to have these nationally determined contributions. And instead of having a global top-down approach, they said this is going to be a bottoms-up. So countries will determine their own contributions, and we will use some common metrics and verify that they are doing actually what they think are doing. And the idea was that these would be incremental changes. So the notion of incrementality, again, was a difficult one to quantify. That, are these new things that you're doing, or are these things that you were doing already and you're relabeling them to fit the Paris Agreement? There was also this notion to revise the target every 5 years. And true enough, in 2020, this Climate Change Conference of Parties changed the target from 2 degrees Celsius and lowered it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And which, if you ask me, the average temperature increase last year, 2024, was 1.49 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. I ask you whether, whether you've you've broken through that threshold or not. And the other bit was that there was also an agreement to have finances mobilized to the tune of $100 billion a year. And that was going to fuel the changes, the adaptation needed. And of course, as you might recall, in 2017, when the previous Trump administration came into office, they pulled out from this agreement altogether, and from the Climate Change Conference of Parties. And because the idea was that common but differentiated responsibilities would be reflected in how the funds are generated, that meant that U.S. had a bigger chunk, and that kind of took the wind out of the sails of this whole initiative. The other thing that came out also in 2015 was the Sustainable Development Goals, and these were, everyone was very excited. These are comprehensive goals, and we tried to cover everything under the sun. I was working for the UN at the time, so I could sense that excitement. And we can argue and discuss whether this was the right framing or not, because there's 17 goals. Each goal has specific targets, which add up to 169, and each goal has 1 or 2 targets, which add up to 232 indicators, and if you count slightly differently, 244 indicators. So this is a global picture, and before I leave this slide, I just want to leave you with 2 thoughts. One was that this was the first time in development and international negotiation history that these targets were meant for everyone. So these weren't targets for those poor developing countries, but they were meant for everyone. So there was this comprehensiveness, inclusiveness that came out. And the second one was that the developed countries found out that it was actually very hard to respond to these targets and these goals. And I can speak from direct experience with the Canadian government. They struggled really quite a lot. They still do, and our federal sustainable development strategy doesn't really align with all these goals. So to give you an example, our strategy for many years did not include the SDG 5 on gender equality. Is it because we're perfect, or is it because the ministries organizing didn't have a box where to put in gender equality? So anyway, those are just thoughts in the passing. I think Sebastian, I don't know if he's here still, he had mentioned SDG 6 in his presentation earlier this afternoon. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on SDG 6 specifically because it has this focus on water. And you look at, and this is a report generated by the UN system, and basically you look at these traffic light indicators on the right-hand side. For all the targets, we're off target. We're not going to meet the target by the year 2030 for any of them. And actually, if you take a step back, that's true also for all the other SDG targets and indicators as well. So there's actually very few things out of those 169 targets that you can say, yes, we're on target and we're going to meet those targets. Interesting footnote here, the target 6A on international cooperation. One of the ways it is measured is how much official development assistance is given by developed countries towards meeting these targets. So there was a dip and a decrease after the COVID-19 pandemic, which is kind of understandable because you're addressing a global crisis. But it hasn't really come back up fully. And also, as a fraction of the overall ODA envelope, as we call it, the fraction that goes towards water has actually reduced as a fraction. So it's actually going in the wrong direction, and that's why you see that red light. So the situation overall is not admirable, let me put it mildly. If you look at drinking water specifically, there's 2.2 billion people who don't have access to safely managed drinking water. And of those 2.2 billion, 80% live in rural areas. So there's a huge rural-urban split, and you can probably see these in these 2 bar graphs on the right side. So there's a huge number of people who don't have access, and there's obviously health consequences, there's consequences for economic development, and in fact at some point we had done this analysis, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, that meeting the water targets is crucial for meeting all the other targets. Each and every of those 169 targets you can actually pull out and say, okay, for gender equality, for health, for food security, for poverty, for all of those you need to have safe water supply available so that people are healthy and are able to contribute to those other goals. Now, let me change gears a little bit and talk about the geopolitical context. And the term I've used here is called order from strength. And let me take just a minute to describe that. From 2000 to 2005, I had the privilege of being part of a large global process called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So I was leading a working group. And there were 4 sort of scenarios that we thought of using as a device to predict what the future might look like. So one was to say everyone is cooperating with each other. The other one was, okay, there's different mosaics and different solutions, but they still click together. And we also had what was called Techno-Garden, that technological advances come in and they take leaps and bounds and things are improved. The fourth scenario is called order from strength, where basically each country goes their own way and the stronger countries pull things in their own direction. There's divergence in ideas, and basically common goals fall through the cracks. Unfortunately, 20 years later, that's the scenario that seems to be coming through. And I'm really, I guess, disappointed in a way that that's where we are, but that's the situation. And that's reflected this order from strength world that we are now. The US-Canada relations have to be seen in that context. So on the one side, we have a history of longest lasting collaboration on water. In 1908, we had signed the treaty with the US, and the International Joint Commission came out of that. In 1960s, the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission came out. And so there's been this great history of not only collaboration, but actually that collaboration being driven by scientific evidence. And we took great pride as Canadians that was the case. Where we are now, it's creating stress on existing treaties, and I'll give you an example in a second from Western Canada. One thing I've said now, I think for at least 15 years, that we should have a national vision for Canada for water. Because sooner or later there's going to be a situation where our neighbors down south are going to come and say, can we take the water in the Great Lakes? Because it's a shared resource, we need it, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way to counter those discussions is to have your own vision of how you see the Great Lakes or how you see our common shared water resources and how to respond. We're not there yet, so I'll circle back to that point as well. Now, when we think of the geopolitical context, we're typically thinking just about the US-Canada relations, but I'll argue that it's actually much bigger. And one aspect of it is the international virtual water trade. So our colleagues at UBC have been nicely pulling together information about how much water is embedded in the agricultural produce that we export. Okay, so the graph here shows those data for 2000, 2010, 2020, and the latest one is from 2 years ago. And the unit here is cubic kilometers per year that are exported. And a cubic kilometer, just to give you an idea, is 1 trillion liters of water. Or if you use a different metric, it's 400 million Olympic-sized pools. So that's 1 cubic kilometer, and we're exporting anywhere from 80 to 100 cubic kilometers. And the main export is through wheat. I would say about 1/3 of it is embedded in wheat. Smaller percentages, 5-6% in canola and beef, respectively, are there. So we're exporting huge amounts of water without really realizing, and how our trade relationship works with the rest of the world, how it works with Canada, those are all geopolitical things, and we saw the Canada-China relationship take a nosedive in the last few years, and that has consequences for what happens to this virtual water export. So we're a net exporter of water. But I'd like you to keep in mind that we're in the 80 to 100 cubic kilometers per year is being exported. I'll come back to that number. So this is the example I was alluding to. Columbia River Treaty, this was a response to major flooding in western US, in Oregon, I think some parts of Idaho and Washington states. And they asked and created an agreement with Canada to provide flood control and also control the generation of hydropower. So a number of dams were built on the Canadian side, one built on the US side, but its reservoir extends into Canada. And the idea was that Canada would provide flood control for 60 years, and the initial investment was $64 million that US paid to build those 3 dams, Duncan, Kenlyside, and Mica. Now, the term of this essentially expired as of last year. And there was a Canadian entitlement, so we're getting 50% of the gains from power production from those 4 dams. And Recently, it has been around $200 to $300 million has been coming to Canada. And the way this treaty is set up, province of British Columbia acts on behalf of the Canadian federal government, and that means all those benefits were coming directly into British Columbia. So right now, almost for the last, I would say, 9-10 years, we've had these conversations, discussions that were originally on the slow boil to how to reshape this treaty, and there were things that were not there. So climate change was not an issue back in early 1960s, and Indigenous participation was essentially non-existent. And also, we have now concerns about fish restoration and what these dams do to aquatic ecosystems. So the jury is still out. So last year, there was a one-year extension that was put in place to continue in the current model. But sooner or later, this has to be decided. And I can tell you that, at least from my perspective, I don't see how this will come out. So there is great level of uncertainty given the current geopolitical context and our relationship with the US government. So something to keep in mind as we go through. So let's talk about how we perceive Canada. So I'll go to another slide of poll. And I have, in this case, limited your choices a little bit, but how would you describe the state of Canada's water resources? It's the same poll as before, by the way. The password is Brace Water Day. Okay, I think we're getting close to full contribution from the audience. So thank you very much again for doing that. And I think this is kind of what I would have expected. The last two editions are, by the way, I think a bit of trick questions. So if you're picking those, that's fine. But you know, I seriously would argue that we're abundant in water resources, but those are not well managed, and actually we have lots to worry about. So I think the top two, I'd say, what is it? About 78% of the responses are with the top two, and that's where I would put my weight behind as well. That those are good. And for those who are in the middle, who are not sure about Canada's water resources, so hopefully this presentation will help you acknowledge and perhaps understand some of the challenges we're facing. So thank you very much for, again, participating. And I'll start with what the Canadian attitudes are towards water. So RBC ran for about a decade this Canadian water attitude study. So every so often, every, I think, 2 or 3 years, they would come out with a study that would say, okay, what's the pulse of the nation? So the latest one was in 2017. And you would start to see some cognitive dissonance here. So water was named as the most valuable natural resource, but at the same time, we're really world-class water wasters. So our sort of urban usage is about 400 liters per capita per day, which is the highest in the world. And there was also thinking that compared to 10 years ago when the survey started, there were fewer actions being taken to conserve water compared to when the process started. People were more convinced that there are risks to our water quality and supply than a decade ago. And at the same time, and this is where the the dissonance come into play as well. That there was confidence in our ability to meet the long-term water needs, and that was confidence at about 84%, which is very high. And I'm not sure what the basis of that confidence was, but that's kind of the pulse of the nation. And also, Canadian feels more personally at risk when it comes to droughts and floods than in the past. And again, cognitive dissonance, 20% of Canadians thinks that climate change is not going to have any impact at all. So again, there's some internal processes and information flows that we need to address and to improve. So here's what the situation looks like. So this is from the 2020 Watersheds Report put out by WWF Canada. And it looked at, and there's lots of detail, so I'm just extracting the big headlines. So if you look at the river basins which are under threat, so these are reds or maroon colored shades, pretty much these follow everywhere there is a Canadian population density. And there's low or very low level of threat, which is only in the Arctic and northern territories. So, and I think my suspicion is the reason why it looks good is that we're not monitoring them very well. And I'll come back to that point. So there's a number of threats which you see on the right-hand side, which are listed, which again are available if you want to go back to this watersheds report. This year, the switch gears, this watershed report was produced by water rangers, and they divided the rivers into the direction where they're flowing, whether down to Gulf of Mexico, towards the Pacific, up to the Arctic Ocean, etc. And again, what I would like to draw your attention to is two facts: that there is no areas which are really very stable, and even when they say the rivers flowing west into Pacific Ocean are good or very good, okay, I'll put a pin in that and see whether that's actually true. And the other one is the grays. So the vast majority is grays where there's no data available. Okay, so I don't know how previously we were saying, things are really hunky-dory in northern territories. And here's what the watershed reports. Again, I'm cherry picking a little bit, but the overall water quality scores, good and fair was about 46%. More than half are data deficient. We don't have data for more than half of the aquatic systems. The same picture reflects pretty much on the water flow scores. But I want to draw your attention to this last box on the right-hand side. So it says 20 million data points were used, and when you look at the distribution, about 61% of those are coming from NGOs. And again, you scratch your head because there's quite a bit of variability in the ability of these NGOs to do the monitoring, and so it changes depending on who you're talking to and what kind of methods they're using. So there's a great need for harmonizing these data across the board. And here's an interesting one. So this gives us a year-by-year breakdown of water consumption across Canada. Okay, again, just a footnote on the scale here. So it says million cubic meters of water withdrawn. And if you take a zero off from the scale on the left-hand side, that would give you cubic kilometers again. Okay, so again, a couple of things to point out. Thermal power generation is consuming about 2/3. The latest numbers we have for 2021, thermal power generation is using up 2/3. And these are Government of Canada stats. And the other thing to say is that when you look at the overall scale, we're using, let's say in 2021, we were using about, I'm eyeballing this, about 35 cubic kilometers. And remember, we are exporting anywhere from 85 to 98 cubic kilometers of water embedded inside our food crops and beef. So interesting, again, I see this as a bit of a cognitive dissonance in Canada, that we're not really connecting the numbers here to the number of, or the volume of water that we're indirectly exporting. Another one is long-term boil water advisories. And many of these, and we heard an example earlier in the afternoon where boil water advisory has been in place for 30 years. And I know there's boil water advisories in BC and Lower Mainland, which had been there for 2 decades, 3 decades also. So back in 2021, this was the snapshot, and this was 5 years after the federal government had announced that they will get rid of all the long-term boil water advisories by in a 5-year window, and this is what remained. I'll give you the recent snapshot, and I want to go back to this notion of long-term boil water advisories. So this is the status as of now. So I just downloaded this from Indigenous Services Canada earlier this week. So you still have actually quite a few of the long-term boil water advisories remaining, and they're, again, where the larger population density is. And in the blue droplets, you also see the number of long-term boil water advisories that have been lifted. So I think there's 2 key things to keep in mind. One, the way the federal government went about solving these problems was a bit technocratic. Also, the flow of funds were made in a way that they were given funds for each year, and the funds will become available within the fiscal calendar, maybe around May or June, and then you had till December to spend all the money, and there was no surety that funds will be available the next year. So it's quite a piecemeal approach, and that's part of the reason why some of these have persisted for so long. And the other one, going back to these blue drops that show the long-term advisories lifted, I think this is don't tell this to anyone. I think this is a bit of a sneaky way of putting this in. And the reason is that the Indigenous Services Canada would go into a community, they would put in a water treatment system, not have good controls, not have mechanisms, and not have trained people to manage it. And a year later, it would break down, and the community would go back to boil water advisory. Except now they're no longer a long-term boil water advisory. So now they're a short-term, so they're outside of this envelope. So I think, like I said, I find that a little bit a sneaky way of getting around numbers. So please take the numbers in the blue droplets with a pinch of salt. Okay, so moving forward, and this is my final bit, let's talk about what the knowledge gaps are and where the future outlook sits. And I would like to start by looking at an outsider's perspective. I had the great fortune of a colleague from South Korean government spend about 1.5 years working at my center. And this is his perception, and I'm just putting those forward without really much editing, on comparison between South Korea and Canada. And his name is Song-jo Yang. He's the Deputy Director in the Ministry of Environment and Republic of Korea. So he said in Canada, there's widespread perception of abundant water resources, whereas in South Korea, there's a public awareness of water scarcity. And of course, the endowment of water is different, but still the mindset of going into it is very different. In Canada, the authority for dealing with water is distributed. This is something we know. So federal government has responsibilities for fisheries, oceans, and international relations. Provincial governments deal with legislation and licensing, and municipal governments deal with supply and wastewater. And as you will notice, First Nations are not mentioned here, at least in his analysis, because at the moment, they are not really actively involved in governance. And we have some models for co-governance on Skeena River Basin in British Columbia that had just started, I think, about 3 years or 4 years ago. So it's still early days for us to see how that works. Integrated water resource management, which is what IWRM is. Canada is strong in investments, but the institutions remain quite weak. He also talked about, and quite appreciatively, the technological advancements we have. Internet of Things and how it's becoming pervasive in the water sector, remote sensing, synthetic aperture radar for looking at water, smart agricultural water monitoring, satellite-based drought forecasting. And this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but he was trying to pick out things which he thought could be taken back to the Korean counterparts. And the next one is an interesting one, that Canada needs a specialized body like K-Water, which is what they have in South Korea, that provides both expertise and can lead policy implementation. And I'll circle back and talk in a minute about the Canada Water Agency. And he concluded with, what can Canada learn from Korea? So he thinks that the institutional framing in South Korea is much better. So we can pick up some of those models, create a master plan, which I would call a water vision, and also create organizations that help implement those plans. He also picked up this notion that province to province, the guidelines are very variable, which becomes a significant stumbling block to implementation of technology, because you come up with a new, fun, interactive technology, but now you have to approve it province by province. You can't have a common approving or standard approving mechanism. Okay, so this is where the Canada Water Agency sits, which became formally active just about a year ago. And it's identified these 5 areas. So it will lead in policy, it will lead in governance, it's going to work on Indigenous relationships, and it will help address some of those data gaps that I was talking about earlier, and it would also enable science. Now, one function that the Canadian Water Agency is serving is providing funding to different initiatives. So far, they have $650 million allocated to it. $420 million of those are allocated to working on Great Lakes, and $230 million is for rest of Canada. So I think there's some question, and I think these are growing pains that the agency is going to go through, and we as academic researchers can help them find their way as they move forward. Now, here's another statistic that I'm not really proud of, which is the water-related publications. So I looked at where things were a decade ago, which is the orange bar, and where we are as of last year, which is the full year. And I did a search on Scopus, just a week ago. So to say the obvious, China has really upped its game, and so it cranked up the number of water publications that are coming out. And others have stayed more or less the same. Canada has, again, had a slight increment in terms of the number of publications, but there's another issue that Canada used to be number 8 in this list in 2015. Now it's slipped to number 12th. So we're actually, instead of gaining a leadership mantle, we're actually slipping farther behind. And again, for me, it's a point to ponder and think upon on why that is and how we can reverse this. There are some significant knowledge gaps, and I've divided them into 3 areas. I'm sure I've left out other things, and I'm hoping that in the discussion that we're going to have now, we'll start to talk about what else should be on this list. So in governance, we don't have a national consensus on what our vision is for Canada's waters. We have to rethink the water governance models, and as I was saying, the example of the Skeena River Basin, we have to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing. And going through this truth and reconciliation process and decolonizing and indigenizing many of these mechanisms is not an easy one, and it requires some concerted effort. At least in British Columbia, the Legislative Assembly, I think about 4 years ago, passed a legislation that the UN, the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is now enshrined in the legislation within BC. So we need to see more of that reflection across the country. Climate change, we are not really well prepared for climate change events. We are really reactive. So we hit problems and we say, okay, now let's start to study, and we're not being proactive. And I think this is a role that we as academia and research community can take on. We're not very good at quantifying community level vulnerabilities in what those are and how they can be addressed. The flood risk mapping, I know there are some initiatives ongoing, but those are not at national scale, and you find lots of variability across the country in terms of where you are, of what the flood risk of where you are. And here in Quebec, for example, again, 5 years ago, I think the Quebec government was actively paying people to relocate from outside floodplains. So I think and I'm going from memory, so don't quote me on that. I think $200,000 or $250,000 were given to households that agreed to relocate from outside of floodplains, which made a lot of sense. But again, this risk mapping and consorted response at the national scale is missing. Use of green infrastructure as part of urban water management is also deficient. And again, my center has done a fair bit of work in discussing this at the British Columbia level, but we know that we are far behind our European counterparts in understanding how the nature-based solutions can work. And finally, data and data accumulation is a problem. We need to harmonize the methods. Even if you have 20 million data points for water quality measured, 64% of them measured by environmental NGOs, we need to up the game a little bit, and we need to harmonize them. We need to use big data and machine learning tools, or artificial intelligence, if you will, to get a better analysis of what our ecosystem health is for different aquatic bodies. And we also need to have a better measurement of economic impacts of floods and extreme events. And I say this having led a tri-national project between US, Canada, and Mexico. And what we found was that Mexico was really well equipped in terms of understanding and documented their economic damages. US was kind of muddled up with different agencies and different government levels. And Canada was terrible in measuring. There's no single place I can go to and get you an information for a flooding, even this 2021 flooding that I was pointing to. I can't go to the Canadian Disaster Database and pull out a number that I'll have good faith in. So here's my final slide, and I'll leave you with some questions, and hopefully these will trigger conversation. Should we actually become leaders in the international community, or we constantly have to play catch up and learn from others? I would argue that we have sufficient capacity. We have water resources, we have experimental places, we have technologies, and we have knowledge base to really become leaders, and we're not yet. So should we do it, and if so, how? Should we have a national water agenda? And remember, I'm not talking about a federal water agenda, I'm talking about a national one. Because people throw in your face this notion that, oh, this federal government doesn't have really jurisdiction on water management at the provincial level. But we can still come together and form a national water agenda. Is Canada Water Agency going to be a game changer? And I don't frankly know the answer, whether it will or not. It's still very early days. Okay, I'll stop here and I'll leave you with the last slide of poll. So in one word, what future would you like to see for Canada Waters? Again, we're limited to 20 characters or less. I'll let that run in the background.
Okay.
Am I the only?
I'll stand here. Oh, is that okay? I think there's only one chair. So.
You can bring in another one.
You get a microphone too. Great. Well, that was both provocative and I think a call for action. So the words are coming up: clean, sustainable, preserved, IWRM. There must be a so this idea of upping our game, I think, is coming through here. Everyone has had a chance to reflect on what was presented. Some of you, it will have triggered thoughts that you might have had before. In others, it's new and you might have some questions. So the floor is open. We have some time to engage in a discussion. There's a microphone there, so please stand and yes, Jim, please kick us off. We need a brave leader. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not brave, but so in terms of the three questions you posed there, yes to the second two, I think. So the Canada Water Agency could be I think it's an empty vessel right now in some sense, that it's something that needs to be established, but whether it's in the right form or not is another question. In terms of the stewardship, or the strategy that we use, the national strategy, I was thinking one of the issues that you released in the knowledge gaps, one thing that I thought was not necessarily apparent is talent creation. When it comes to Indigenous communities, for example, we could mobilize the technologies, but if there's nobody there to operate, maintain these systems over a long time. So I sometimes worry that we are training talent, but not necessarily for the conditions where they're best utilized. So, for example, if we're training Indigenous engineers, I would love to train them such that they can actually thrive in their local community rather than thriving in the urban context. So we kind of create our own unfortunate brain drain to urban centers as a result. And I'll just say that to your first question about international leader, I never liked that because it implies almost a competition. And I'd say that, yes, Canada should be an international leader in respects that matter, I guess, that are relevant most to Canada, and that we could share with others who have similar priorities. Because to me, this is a collaborative effort that has to happen across the world. And like conditions should, people in like similar conditions should actually start working carefully. So I wouldn't want to see a national strategy that wants us to be necessarily a leader in the world, except as maybe seen to be very proactive in stewarding our limited water resources. So I'll just, maybe just as a question, in the sense, the talent creation thing. To me, that's one of the most critical things that I feel is missing. That a lot of the things, even pointed out in the Canada Water Agency, seem to be very heavily focused on data collection, maybe definition of the problem, leading to policy, and I don't disagree with that in any way whatsoever. But I'm wondering more about the kind of getting people on the ground to actually do the required work that is necessary, and whether talent creation should be a key mandate for a Canada Water Agency.
Thoughts and responses?
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agreed with all three of your points. We do need talent creation, and I think, again, we have all the mechanisms, particularly in universities, geared up for cranking out people who are able to take on those roles. I also agree with your point about creating talent in Indigenous communities. And that's actually requires a lot of persistent effort. Because what that requires is that you build long-term relationships with the Indigenous communities. And there is some inherent distrust from them in the first place. And you have to overcome that by long-term engagement. And, for example, my center has worked for, since 2018, so about 7 years now, with Kitasu and Hayes First Nation. And we still feel that sometimes there is a distance that we cannot easily bridge. So creating those bridges, persevering, and being able to use those as a channel to engage youth, who can then become the talent that we create. And that's why I was saying, in that particular community, we have engaged with the school quite directly. So when the greenhouse is maintained, the school children are responsible for certain parts of it. They're creating grow boxes, et cetera, and that's part of the STEM training. So we hope that at least some of them will, because of that STEM focus, will actually end up in engineering or other sciences that are really needed. The underlying problem is that, unfortunately, because of the colonial impacts and even some neo-colonial impacts, the population numbers are sometimes fairly diminished. So that's something we also have to keep into our consideration in how that talent creation works. And fully agree with your third point about Canada Water Agency being an empty vessel. And we had good discussions this morning with Gordon and other colleagues from Brace Water Center, that we as a research community have an opportunity to define what goes into that vessel. So thanks for all your comments.
Great, thank you very much. Please, would you be so kind so everyone can hear?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the presentation. Very hard to digest data. It's very impactful to see all of that numbers being, I don't want to say discouraging, but there's still gaps and stuff that needs to be done. When you mentioned the all that water that is being exported through food, that we're basically not thinking of that, had me thinking, is there other areas that water is also used that we're losing water? For example, I don't know, in industries like construction, you need to use water, or to factories. All that water is considered in these statistics, or is not considered in that loss of water, use of water, contamination of water?
Well, those were just the volume figures. So it does take into account the industrial usage of water. And you could see that the thermal energy generation, even though that's a smaller fraction of energy generation throughout Canada, it still consumes almost like 50–60% of the water in any given year. So the short answer is yes, those things are considered. But the thermal energy sector just sort of overshadows everything else that's there. So again, interesting anecdote. I was involved in a group study taken on by an organization called NRT, the National Roundtable on Economy and the Environment, which is based in Ottawa. It undertook a sector-by-sector study of how different sectors felt about climate change and water resources. And it's split the energy sector in hydropower and everything else, mostly thermal. Both of those sectors, and there were lots of roundtable discussions, both of those sectors came back and said, climate change is not an issue for us, and water is certainly not an issue for us. And again, you scratch your head and you say, how is that? I mean, how is hydropower not impacted by climate change, and water is just as mind-boggling. Footnote to that story, NRT was defunded by the Harper government, and they shut it down. I think the year was 2014 maybe, or 2013. Not only did they shut it down, they said they were going to sequester all the publications that NRT had behind a firewall, and you would have to go through a Freedom of Information Act request to get those released. Unfortunately, University of Ottawa stepped forward and they said, we're going to house all of those documents. They will be publicly available. So that part was saved. But government policy kind of tripped us at a point where all of that information was about to disappear. Anyway, that's a side footnote. The real point is that those sectors, and there was also manufacturing sector was in there, the agricultural sector was in there. And so the understanding within the sector of what water issues are and how climate change is playing into those is fairly limited. So that's kind of what I took out from that study.
And if I may have a second question. At the beginning of your presentation, a lot of people mentioned misinformation. And I guess all of these policies and action that have to come from the government, government gets distracted with a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of other problems happening. How can these information, how can we as academics provide this information to the public so they can demand this to the government? What would you say is the best way to inform people of these in a way that is encouraging and digestible?
Right, and I think you're answering part of the question yourself. I think this digestibility of information is one key. So I think researchers, and I count myself in those, are typically not very good at communicating to public. And what we found is that you need to have knowledge broker institutions in universities that allow you to translate from hardcore research to publicly accessible information. So in SFU, we have a knowledge management hub, which serves precisely that bridging function or translating function, whichever you wish to describe. And so you need to have that process to information be translated. So that's one of the mechanisms. Secondly, we need to have more community engaged research, community engaged monitoring. So while I was saying, okay, there's out of those 20 million data points, 64% are coming from environmental NGOs, but those are actually really data that are collected at the community level. So community folks, school children, et cetera, are involved in collecting those data. And that's a great way of making somebody aware of what the issues are by actually having them roll up their sleeves and go out and collect samples, or making them more available to the general public. And the third key is to do some, for lack of a better term, advocacy work with the federal government and with provincial governments. And again, as we were just discussing, Canada Water Agency can be a tool for becoming this channel where you reach out directly to politicians. So I think that kind of political interface, again, is something that doesn't come easily to researchers, but there are ways of getting that done, and again, having those knowledge broker institutions help.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder whether there's also a deeper issue too, when you were saying that Canadians, and I'm probably guilty of this, 400 litres a day, usage of water, the highest in the world. So the cost of water is, the price of water is not necessarily reflecting the cost, and as a result, our minds are not disciplined around the idea of water being scarce. I don't know. I'm not arguing for more taxes. I'm just saying we get it really cheap. I saw a comment. Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I just came to the microphone. Thank you very much for the presentation. I do some research in international water law, so my questions are coming from that angle, trying to connect to your presentation. I have two main concerns. One regards the attempt by the Canadian government to implement the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the recent shelving of the First Nation Clean Water Act that was tabled and very quickly went off everybody's mind when governments changed, and apparently there was some kind of mixed reception and perhaps concern regarding the original input by First Nations regarding the act. So my question would be, do you think that's going to be hopefully taken up again, perhaps in a better way, or do you think this could be another, empty vessel, sort of like sharing the concerns we might have about the Canadian Water Agency? And the other aspect of my question would regard cooperation. So you mentioned the Columbia River Basin, and that's clearly not a great example of successful cooperation, at least prospectively, whatever it has been in the past. So, of course, there's many other examples we could pick regarding the cooperation between Canada and the US, which, historically has been a big interlocutor for cooperative governance from an international legal perspective for Canada. But of course, there's, as you mentioned, a lot of virtual water cooperation or, trade with other countries. So I'm wondering if Canada has any interest in implementing international legislation such as the 1997 Convention or the UNEC Water Convention, and if that can also help to some degree to achieve climate change sort of preparedness and more of a proactive approach. Thank you.
Great questions, both. So let me start with the first one. In engaging with Indigenous communities and revising Canada Water Act, I think the starting point is that our legislation is quite out of date at this point in time. So we don't really have a legislative framework that's done correctly. In my view, I think it's a two-step process to get to something like a Canada Water Act. So you need to build consensus on what is it that you want to do. Trying to build legislation in itself is not going to lead to a good outcome. You're going to make more people unhappy than achieve anything positive. And that's why I keep harping on this point that we need to have a common national vision. The Indigenous communities, the First Nations, the Assembly of First Nations all have to be part of that conversation. and to shape up, and the indigenous ways of knowing have to be incorporated in that vision. Once you have that, then you can start to work on what legislation would actually help you achieve that. So I think, again, there's, like many other things, there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance in the Canadian conversation on this point, that you've not identified what is it that you want, but you're working on trying to develop legislation. So I think that's at least my thinking, is that you have to go at it stepwise. Now, in terms of the international relations and whether we can use the UN Economic Commission for Europe, which is what UNECE is, Water Courses Convention, which is actively, which was designed for the European Commission, but it has actually been opened up, and it's anyone in the world can join. And it basically defined the terms and the details on how international cooperation can be structured. So whether we can pick that up and use it for a treaty like the Columbia River Treaty to modify it, I would say in an ideal world, yes, that's the way to go, because UNECE Water Courses Convention also talks about navigation, sharing of resources, upstream, downstream relationships. All of those things are very nicely described in a frame that is usable. Whether it will be used, my guess is probably not. And the reason is that I think our counterparts down south would balk at anything that has to do with UN, because of this allergic reaction they have to UN processes and UN systems. I think you might sneak it in behind the scenes and use its framing for redesigning the Columbia River Treaty. I think using it explicitly might be a little bit more challenging. And that might apply to other conversation and other discussions, in other contexts in US-Canada relationships.
And I guess it's not even, sorry, can you hear me?
So if you want to come up to the mic, because it's being recorded. So.
I guess even beside considering Canadian relationship with the US, like envisioning Canada subscribing to the convention to sort of, signal at the very least its own commitment is not in the picture either, because of this sort of,
Sure. By the way, there is also the UN Water Courses Convention, which you mentioned. So I think UNECE Water Courses Convention is a little bit more active. The other one has taken about 30 years to get to a point where it's legally active. So yes, I would say as a principal point, yes, Canada should sign on, and you need to ratify it, meaning that our parliament will have to approve of us signing on to it, which means that all the stipulations in it, and they're all meant for transboundary water resources, all of them will become kind of guiding principles on the Canadian side. So yes, I think that's a good idea. The question is, how do you convince people sitting in Parliament Hill to say that yes, it is great. What is Canada getting out of it, and why should we sign on?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for those comments.
Another comment. I did notice that we have a response here that is befriended. So if the person who wrote that would like to stand up at some point and tell us from what perspective. I think I know what it means, but if anyone wanted to raise something about that would be interesting. Anyway, please.
Okay, I think it was a very insightful presentation. I've just been thinking, I know Canada is the second largest country by land area, and there's a lot of variation across the provinces. So I'm wondering how practical it is to have a national water guideline, considering the variation in precipitation, because it's like there's so much variation, and it's going to affect how people live their lives. The water consciousness basically depends on the availability. Also, I was thinking about the water loss due to food exports, and like thinking in terms of solutions. Like, we know this is a way water is lost. Well, how do we balance that, right? Short of importing foods or stuff, or like how do we find a balance between that, because it does serve an economic purpose that keeps the country running. It's like, where do we stand on that?
Thanks. Do you mind explaining what you mean by national water guideline? What exactly are you talking about?
Okay, so in the presentation, you talked about the fact that water management is done at a provincial level, right? And there is no overarching.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so like it's been done at a provincial level basically currently, and there's no. When I think of water guidelines, I think, well, this is an average we're targeting, an average per capita use we're targeting, right, across the nation.
Right.
That's like what I'm thinking at the basic level.
So we have water quality guidelines, which are at least available nationally. They're not really implemented in quite the same way. But I think what you're referring to is more of a common vision and a common action plan of what we want to do and setting up some targets within that. Is that, am I understanding your question correctly?
I think it can branch off into water quality guidelines and water use guidelines,
right,
in terms of volume, yeah.
Right. So again, I think there's a need for having that kind of harmonization, and we have to think beyond this federal-provincial split. I think as long as we'll stay stuck in that, it's not going to. We can almost get paralyzed, and we're not going to keep moving forward. So that's, my argument is to start the conversation and see how you actually implement it. So we haven't done the first step, so I can't quite answer the second step, which is what the national water guidelines would be, either for quality or for usage. Those have to come from what our common and shared vision is for resources. The other point about exporting virtual water. So I didn't use the word water loss. I said water exports, virtual water exports. So it's not really well, yes, I guess it's a loss or it's an export to Canada. And the question is that when you think about how do we want to view our water, virtual water has never been part of that conversation. And like I said, our national consumption is at about 45 cubic kilometers per year, and we're exporting about 90. So twice as much is going out, and okay, it's not a loss in quite the sense because Canada's earning foreign exchange and there's flow of funds coming in response to that. And in some ways, you can also say that Canada has a responsibility towards the international community to become, to provide food just because we have a larger land space and we are better endowed in water resources. So you can flip the question around and say, what is Canada's responsibility towards feeding the rest of the world? And again, we haven't really had that conversation either. So I'm not sure that it is so much a question of balancing. So if you're losing 95 cubic kilometers, that doesn't mean we import an equivalent amount, but that's something to ponder upon on what this equation means in the long run. And we have to think about also precipitation, and if the precipitation volume is increasing because of climate change, that means we have more water to play with, if you will. And so again, connect all those dots together to come out with an answer on whether we should continue exporting food or whether we should scale it back to some extent.
Thank you.
So it sounds like Canada has quite a lot of conversations to have about water, and that maybe haven't been had, and it's time to start having them. But they're going to be complicated, and I think they're going to require a lot of data and research and input from people who are passionate. I think I'm going to look at the clock and see that we're getting to the end of this session, so we're going to let you off the hook. There's been a huge effort to come over here and present and sit here and engage with us. Thank you so much, Professor Adeel. Join me, please, in saying thank you. So lots of food for thought. We're perfectly primed for the next and final phase of the Brace Water Day, which is, in some ways the funnest part. That's the social part. But before we go there, I want a few short words. I'd like to thank the Brace team sincerely for all of their hard work to make today happen. A lot of work has gone on. It's gone very well. Thank you all. Very impressive. And I think everyone will agree that it's been a success. But I also want to thank the volunteers. It was great to see you in those Brace t-shirts, directing traffic, helping us have a successful day. So thank you everyone who contributed as a volunteer. Very excited, and it's, I didn't mention it in my opening remarks, but we have also established a BRACE trainee committee, I believe it's called, for graduate students to both organize and develop initiatives around water on campus, but also to contribute to different events and develop leadership skills and maybe new experiences while you're at McGill beyond what you get in a lab. So please, if you're interested in that, reach out to Monica. And so now I'd like to invite you all to join us for a cocktail reception. Have a little bit of time together, relax. The posters are still up. We'd like you to have a look. If you haven't seen some posters, challenge the grad students, get them to give you their spiel. There's 15 or more, so you're going to have to move fairly quickly, but we've got some stickers. We'd like you to vote for the ones that you think are the most. You can do it on whatever criteria you like. The prettiest, the best content, the best presentation, whatever it is. It's essentially a popularity contest. And at the end, we're going to give some prizes, and that will close, voting will close at 5 p.m. So we've got half an hour. You can have a drink and engage. So please stay connected with us. If you're in the room and you're not a member and you're on the fence, join. It's fairly straightforward. There are benefits. We're working on that. My vision to make BRACE the best centre you're part of, one of the funnest centres you're part of, and one of the ones that offers you and your students some of the best benefits. So we're also really keen to hear suggestions from members about what might be good things to do or interesting initiatives. And if you're not sure or you're not eligible to be a member but you want to stay in touch, please sign up for our newsletter, and you get a sort of a regular check-in on what we're up to. It might be interesting. So thank you all for being part of BRACE Water Day. Thanks to everyone who spoke and for all the people who've attended. And yeah, that's the end.